This video is a follow-up of my last position analysis video. In that video we had a position on the left and many club players had difficulty evaluating the move h3. According to those players, they said the bishop will go to h5. I still did not address the threat of knight e5, attacking the knight on f3, and I cannot play g4 because that would be too weakening for my king to play h3 and g4 and to move two pawns in front of my king based on general chess principles. And actually we found out that after g4 white is completely safe and fine, but I wanted to explore further this notion of this chess principle that you should not move your pawns in front of your king. And I specifically looked at the structure that we have depicted on the right, so with a pawn on f2, a pawn on g4 and a pawn on h3 where white has castled short, so with a king on g1. And I searched the mega database for it, and I found that this position occurred in 410,000 games. So that's quite a high number of games. So it's not an exception in 410,000 games, and that includes the structure mirrored for black horizontally. So when black plays h6 and g5 and has a pawn on f7 and a king on g8. So before we go there, let's evaluate the pros and cons of h3 and g4. So it gains space, right? The pawn on g4 controls the squares on f5 and h5. On the flip side, these squares have been weakened. So f4 and h4 in general, not in this specific position, you could say, but because there's still a pawn on e3, but when you push a pawn, of course, you gain control and you lose control. It unpins, in this case, because often there's a bishop on g4, the knight on f3. And in many situations, the knight on f3 can go to h4 or to e5 and then attack the bishop on g6. And that allows white to get the bishop pair. In some situations, there's a knight on e2, and this knight on e2 can go to g3 and then later to f5. And depending on the situation, it might happen that after h3-g4, white continues with f4 and gets like a pawn steamroller going, and often it leads to an attack on the black king. And then the question is, can black easily attack white's pawn structure and exploit the weaknesses on h4 and f4 and undermine it with a move like h5? So I analyzed the 220,000 white games with this structure and tried to draw some conclusions, and they are very surprising. I hope that you stay until the end, because I'm also going to discuss one puzzle from Michael Adams' book, Things Like a Super GM, where he looks at chess dogmas and when they apply and when they don't apply. So it's the first thing I'd like to show is this game between Tabe and Ivic from Tata Steel in 2023. So let's quickly go through the game until we reach the crucial point. So h3, right? Castle short, so castle towards, you could say, the weakened pawn structure, knight e4, e3. And now we have a structure that you could say is very similar to the one in the exercise. And here, the white player has different options. You could play king h2. There's a tactical option to play knight c5, followed by knight takes c5, and then rook takes c5, bishop takes h3, rook takes d5. So let me show you that. Knight c5. Right, this would be a tactical option. Or, like what happened in the game, g4. So this was the choice of the white player, rated 2686, and not afraid of weakening his pawn structure. And then if you look at, after everything the game was played, this is the final position, and the pawn structure is just as it has been started. So no weakness. So I started then to explore if there are like standard openings in which this h3-g4 happens, and is like, you could say, part of standard opening theory. So let's look at a few examples. So this is David Navarra playing with white, winning against Caspi in the European Cup in 2015. So we have here a Scandinavian opening. And I saw that actually David Navarra very often plays h3 and g4. And again, white played h3 and g4 followed by knight e5, right? And so when we looked at the summary, right, it is to unpin the knight, deactivate the bishop on g4, and you can see here that it's being attacked. And now this makes it even more difficult to play h5, because white can take on g6, and then the pawn structure of black has been severely damaged, because then e6 and g6 are very weak. The knight has been activated with tempo. So it is standard practice in the Scandinavian opening. That's the first example. Let's look at the second example. This is Jobava with white against Jan Christoph Duda. And again, you will not be surprised. This is like a close Sicilian, right? That white plays h3 and g4, right? And in this case, right, after rook b8, white follows up with f4. So this is the example that white is starting with his steamroller and has pawns on g4, f4, and e4. And I think no player will say here, oh, white has significantly weakened their king by playing h3 and g4. No, this is again standard opening theory. So we have seen the Scandinavian, the closed Sicilian, and there are of course many other examples. This is Ian Nepomniachtchi, and this is a standard Najdorf. Right, and so white now chooses to castle in his, what many club players think is weakened structure on the king side. And now we see one of the other points I made, that h3-g4 allows this maneuver, knight e2 to g3, and then the knight has a square on f5. And that is what happened, and white went on to win the game. Final game here, so a final game regarding the openings. This is Peter Svidler against Kramnik. So this is a Reti opening. And again, right, so on move 7, we see the move h3 and g4, bishop g6, knight h4, threatening the bishop on g6, and let's just see how this continues for a moment. And after queen c7, white volunteers to castle short into his structure with h3 and g4. And now we get opposite side castling, so you would say this is extremely dangerous for white, because he has a compromised pawn structure. But Peter Svidler went on to win this game. And now threatens to win the bishop on g6. And so in this whole game, the weakness of the pawn structure did not play a significant role. Here, Kramnik decided to sacrifice a piece and go for counterplay. Perhaps you would ask yourself what happens after queen c7, right? Because this prevents f5, because then there's queen h2. But then white can just continue with e4, and has to be careful, of course, for queen h2. So it plays a role here in the analysis, but there was not, it didn't happen in the game. And Peter Svidler went on to win this game in the Russian Championship. And let me close out by one game of world champion Garry Kasparov against Michael Adams. And Michael Adams, of course, is, so we have here the Petrov, right? So we saw it now in many openings. It's just standard practice. And Michael Adams is, of course, a very solid player. And this is from Linares 2002. And so far, of course, it didn't happen yet. So bishop e3, rook a2, and now we see h3. So this is the example where there's not even a bishop on g2 to defend the king on g1, but the bishop is on e2. And now look what Kasparov does. g4 in front of his own king. Bishop g6, and then even g5, another move with a pawn in front of his own king. And then the knight is being activated, takes away the bishop on g6, and then c5. Well, this almost feels like chess meets Fight Club, right? If you see the aggression by white, playing h3, g4 in front of his own king, then pushing g5, then pushing c5. So you would say you have to be Kasparov to play this. But the interesting thing is that actually this was played in 2002 in Linares in round 5, and then later on is that Anand repeated this line against Michael Adams in the same tournament, and he made a draw, and Kasparov went on to win this game. So he played c5 here, and but they continued to follow the same position until move 25, and this is move 24. So until this moment, they were following the same game in the same tournament, the two world champions, Anand and Kasparov. And so you can see that even without a bishop on g2, some players dare to play h3-g4, and here even followed up by g5. So let's recap and think about h3 and g4. So in total there were 410,000 games, 220,000 games by white. It's standard practice in openings. It gains space. Yeah. We saw you gain control over f5 and h5. It restricts the opponent's bishop. It unpins the knight on f3 in many cases. It often allows white to get the bishop pair, like also in this game with knight f3, knight e5, knight takes g6. Sometimes it's knight f3, knight h4, knight takes g6. We saw in the game of Nepomniachtchi that he played knight e2, knight g3, knight f5, because we get control over the square f5, and that was in the Najdorf, the h3 variation, where he went on to win. And we saw also in the game by Jobava, in this close Sicilian, that he combined it with f4, so f4, g4, h3, to start an attack and have a pawn steamroller to attack the black king. What surprised me that in the hundreds of games that I looked at for this analysis, that not once white was checkmated because of the weakened pawn structure. So I think for a lot of club players that will be surprising. It was even surprising for myself that it's standard practice in many openings, and actually the number of cases where black wins because white has severely damaged their pawn structure is very limited. So let's switch now to the book by Michael Adams. And so this is Forward Chess, and this is book Think Like a Super GM, and this is chapter 4.3, Why Can't I Not Play Like a Super GM, which summarizes the conclusion of the 40 puzzles that were solved by people from different strengths. And what you see here, that his conclusion is super GMs are not constrained by dogma. Right? Many participants failed to solve some of the puzzles simply because they rejected good moves based on dogma or prejudice. Super GMs, on the other hand, will investigate promising ideas further even if they contravene general principles. Of course, it's very difficult for club players to know when you can violate principles and when you cannot. Well, we saw with h3 and g4 that actually in most cases it's not dangerous at all. So let's look at the position that is part of the analysis in this book. So this is the position, and the question to you is, how would you continue here? So what would be your move? So if you would like to pause the video and analyze it, this is a good moment. And many club players would say, oh, you know, I can bring my rook to the half-open file, and I can play rook f1 here. Right? I gain a tempo, and because I am attacking the queen, I occupy the half-open file. That's what I'm going to play. Or they would say, oh, there's an undefended piece on b7, let me attack it. So I play queen b6 to attack the bishop on b7. So what I deliberately did not do, right, is take our 3 steps in the analysis process, and the first one is orientation. So let's do the orientation and see what's going on. bishop b7 and the pawn on e6 are undefended. White has a pin of the queen on d4 to the king on g7. So the pawn on d6 and e6 are weak. Black's king is relatively unsafe, right? It's like there are many squares around the king that can be attacked. There's also a second pin. The rook on d1 and the queen on d4 are pinning the pawn on d6 to the rook on d8. And finally, when we look at piece activity in this position, what do you think of the piece activity of the knight on c3 and the bishop on e2? What are the squares that the knight on c3 currently can go to? It can only go to a2. And the bishop on e2 is looking to the pawn on b5 and is looking to the pawn on g4 and also has very limited activity. How do we activate bishops in general in chess? And in order to do that, we have to create space for the bishops to shine. Right? We have to move pawns so that squares become available and lines become available for bishops. So after rook f1, right, let's go back to that move. Right? Black plays queen e7, and now look what we did. The vulnerability of the pin over the d-file is gone. e6 is no longer undefended. The queen and the bishop on b7 is no longer undefended. So we played one move, like based on gut feel, and we solved three vulnerabilities in the black position by it. And black is doing okay. So we have to be very concrete here. And the surprising move here, right, and that has to do with activating the knight on c3 and the bishop on e2, is to play the move a4 here. So we attack the pawn on b5. It's now under attack by the pawn on a4, the bishop on e2 and the knight on c3, so it cannot be properly defended. It cannot be pushed, because after b4 the queen on d4 takes the pawn. So black is forced to take. And now let's look what has happened, right? The knight can go to b6. The knight can also go, because a pinned piece is a poor defender, so d6 is actually, because it's pinned, a poor defender. The knight can go to c5, and the bishop can go to c4, right? So, for instance, if black would say, I'm going to play rook d7, we have knight c5, and that's possible because of the pin d4 to e5 to g7, right? So after d takes c5, the queen takes on e5 and winning the game. So suddenly, right, we see that the activity of the knight has increased. White has an immediate threat of knight c5. White can activate their knight by going knight b6, and bishop c4 has come in the position. And of course, you can say you are pushing a pawn in front of your own king, but also to realize which attackers from the black side can exploit that, right? There are no attackers from the black side near the white king, and black does not control the b-file. So in general, when you think about these chess principles, you have to combine it with the specifics of the situation, and in this case, the activation of the bishop and the knight more than outweighed the potential weakness of pushing the pawns and opening up the B file for black, because also black was unable to exploit it. I hope you found this video useful, and I hope you subscribe and like this video. Thank you very much for watching.